Hello! The topic of today's lecture is behavioral neurobiology. For several lectures now, we talked about what happens in the brain, what the brain is made of, and now we need to change pace a little bit and talk about what the brain is actually used for. So what is behavioral neurobiology? There are many things you can study about the brain, many kinds of questions that you can ask. You can ask questions about brain development. So where does it come from? You can also study lots of things that can be characterized as housekeeping. So all the processes that have to be happening in order for the brain to function. What we talked about, action potential or synaptic transmission, many of these fundamental processes that happen in the brain are just required for the brain to function. Or another interesting topic, and important, charged one, is all sorts of pathology. So everything that can go wrong with the brain, and then hopefully how to prevent it or how to fix it. And many people study that, but ultimately, if you think of that, all of these questions only make sense in view of the more global question of why the brain is even there, the actual functions of the brain. Why do we have the brain? Why do other animals have the brain? What it is used for? And in us, it can be framed as cognitive functions. So you can study, for example, in humans, when you work in humans, you can study perception separately, or you can study motor control, how we move our hands, how we talk. You can study memory, you can study emotions, because with humans, you can do things like look at this picture and look at this picture. Which one do you prefer? Which one do you like more? Why? What do you think about when you hear a certain word, right? You can even ask weird questions like imagine an elephant and then tell me something about it. So you can make all sorts of shortcuts because you can talk to a human and you can analyze some part of the thinking kind of in an abstract way, not really caring about everything that happened before and everything that happens after. But with animals, you don't have this luxury. Because with animals, you cannot talk to them. Well, you can talk to them, but it won't necessarily help. Because even for smartest animals, you cannot ask them a question to get insight into their inner world, right? You cannot ask a dog whether a certain picture reminds it of its childhood. Or again, you can ask, but it won't answer. You have to use behaviors. All that you have with animals is behaviors. Sometimes you can train them to do something. Sometimes you just look at the behaviors as they are. But with animals, it becomes crucial that you understand what they do and how they do and what they can do and what they cannot do. And then you can ask all sorts of questions about the brain that ultimately underlies these behaviors, makes them possible, makes them happen. And this is what we'll be talking about in this lecture. So primarily not even the brain part, but how do you even study behaviors? Because if you think of it, it's not a trivial question at all. For example, here we have a bird colony. And clearly lots of things are happening here at any given moment. Some birds are going to forage to find some food. Some birds are returning. Some birds may be nesting or raising their young or fighting for space. So lots of things are happening at any given moment. How do you even study that? Actually, I want you to answer this question in the sense that will be one of those questions when I will finish my sentence, and then I will ask you to pause the video and try to come up with a plan. Imagine that you're the first human to ever consider studying these birds. How do you even start? What is your plan? Pause the video, try to answer this question. All right, what can you do? One thing that probably inspires hope is that all of these animals belong to the same species. And if you look at birds of the same species, you will notice that they're similar. They look similarly, their anatomy is similar, and it kind of gives you hope, and it's totally like common sense, that the behavior of these birds is probably also similar in some way. If they move around, they probably move similarly. They fly, they swim, walk in similar ways. They raise their young, probably using same techniques and same strategies. They probably catch similar food. Of course, there may be an occasional bird that does something slightly differently, but most probably they rely again on same techniques and strategies as they catch their food, as they raise their young, as they negotiate their territory. So just the fact that you have lots of animals of the same species gives you the first prerequisite for doing science. You can have repetition. You can go from anecdote to data. If you find anything that you can measure in one bird, you can measure it in hundreds of birds. Whatever you decide to record, to write down, to count, you can do it again and again in different birds, and thus kind of transcend from the level of a one bird story to the level of, okay, that happens with this particular species, that's what they do. And if you just follow this simple strategy, so you take your binoculars, you sit down, you start looking at birds, you start noticing patterns. And here's one thing that you might notice. Birds that nest on the ground, that build their nests on the ground, often face a peculiar problem. One of the eggs kind of rolls out of the nest. And so now the bird is sitting on the eggs, but one of the eggs is not in the nest, but nearby. So what the bird does, it retrieves the egg. That makes sense, right? But as you look at that, you start to realize interesting things. The bird always retrieves the egg in the same way. And not only this bird, every bird that you can see does the same peculiar behavior. So it's sitting on the eggs, or at least is oriented towards like the nest with its rear end. And then it extends its neck and with its head, with its beak, specifically with the lower side of its beak, as is shown in the picture, it rolls the egg towards the nest. And you look at it again and again and you see that that's what's happening every time. So you never see a bird using the side of their beak. You never see a bird that would like push the egg, that would go on the other end, like around the egg and would try to push it soccer style. You never see that. It's always extending the head and using the lower side of the beak to roll the egg. And it's so stereotypic that at some point you feel like you have to name it. And so you name it egg rolling behavior because it looks like a behavior, like something that happens sometimes, not all the time, but when it happens, you instantly recognize it. And that's the first step. So now you have something to study. You start studying that, and then what you notice is that it's actually even more peculiar. Not only it always does it in the same way, it doesn't check whether it succeeded. What does it mean? If you think of a human who's doing something, the human will probably at the end they will check whether it actually happened, right? If the human dropped their keys, they would probably pick up the keys and they will check that they actually succeeded in picking up the keys or putting them in their pocket. But the bird just does the motion and that's it. In this case, it's exaggerated because here we see quails, and you can see that these quails are not in a normal environment. There is no nest. They're in a cage. So the quail sees the egg, it rolls it, and nothing happens after. But then it moves, and it sees the egg again, and it rolls it again to a different position. It looks weird, but you can clearly see the point. It rolls the egg when it sees the egg, and it doesn't check whether it arrived at some particular destination. It doesn't do the endpoint check after the behavior is over. And then, as you keep working with it, you notice another thing that's even more peculiar. Once one of the birds, or some of the birds, get used to you to the extent that you can approach them and they don't freak out because you spent months there, remember? You can try to quickly move the egg from the bird as it's doing the egg rolling behavior. And then a strange thing happens. It continues the motion. So it was doing these motions with the lower part of the beak, and it continues these motions even though the egg is no longer there. So not only doesn't it check that the egg arrived at the destination, it also doesn't check whether the egg was there during the process. Once the behavior was initiated, it was just going on. It was just happening, regardless of whether it was successful or not. And that's bizarre. That's not what humans do, right? Unless you're acting completely absent-mindedly and trying to dissolve your sugar coffee in a cup without putting any coffee in. It happens to us when we kind of fail, but the bird does it every time. Why? Like, how do they even alive, these birds, if they don't check whether the behavior they're performing makes sense? How did they survive till now? How come they didn't go extinct? What do you think? Make a bet. Yeah, I guess you know what's going on, right? There is no need for the bird to be prepared for the appearance of a person who is going to steal the egg from it. There was no point for evolution to prepare the bird for the encounter with you. In real life, probably, if the egg rolled away and you did all the motions, the egg arrived at the destination. And if it did not, what's the big deal? You will see it again and you will try again. It's all right. And so the behavior that we have, even though it looks bizarre to a human in a way, it works just fine. The name for this kind of behavior is a fixed action pattern. And it's also kind of long and impossible to abbreviate for reasons. But the definition is that it's stereotypic. It always happens kind of in the same way, or at least very similarly, within each animal and across different animals of the same species. That's one thing. And second, once initiated, it's executed in its entirety. So you don't check midway whether you're doing well. You're just doing the entire behavior and then deal with the consequences. So, can you come up with some other examples of some behaviors that are like that are stereotypic and that never end in the middle, that are always completed? I mean, obviously, if you approach the goose and like physically push it, you will be able to stop the behavior. But the goose won't just stop doing it in the middle on its own, I guess. Can you come up with some examples here? And a special bonus points if you can come up with examples in a human. Do humans have fixed action patterns? Maybe they don't, but maybe they do. Come up with some example, please. Pause the video, come up with an example, then we'll continue. Good. Did you find anything in a human that looks like that? I guess one good example is sneezing. Think of that. It always happens in the same way, slightly differently, but it's pretty stereotypic. There is a learned component to it, actually. Sneezing is different in different cultures. Deaf people don't sneeze as loudly as people who can hear well, but still. And by the way, why do we sneeze? What's the point? Yeah, we sneeze because we are trying to clean our airways. So we really quickly expel air through our airways, through our nose probably, to like clean it up. So it's a useful behavior. For example, if you accidentally inhaled some dust and hay, that's a good idea to sneeze then. And sneezing is pretty hard to stop, right? That's another thing that's reminiscent of fixed action patterns in a bird. You don't check mid-sneeze whether the sneeze is going well. Here's another example, vomiting. And it's not a pleasant example, but it's actually very interesting because most people, don't realize just how complex vomiting is. Why do we vomit? Usually because there is something in our digestive system that shouldn't be there. Maybe it was poisonous, and so it makes sense to clean up. But the thing is, you only start noticing negative effects of something that you ate once it reached your gut, and stuff from the food starts to get into the blood. And gut intestines are pretty far away from your mouth. There is the esophagus, this tube, and then the stomach in the way. So how to get food back from there? It turns out that there are several steps to it. So first, you have to expel the content of your intestines, or at least the first several feet of it, into your stomach. The opening from the stomach to the gut opens, and the gut tries to squeeze everything into the stomach. But now you need to get it out of the body, which means that you have to close the special valve that sits between your stomach and your gut so that it wouldn't go back. And then you compress the stomach with all the force that you can muster, and you expel things through the esophagus and through the mouth outside. So it's a complex process that has several stages, and all stages should be present. Right? You cannot just skip one or two. You have to have all of them in this specific order without omissions, otherwise nothing will work. And also, interestingly, you kind of have to finish. There is no point in doing it if you stop midway. And that's actually what's happening. And if you ever were violently sick, kind of unexpectedly, you know that there is this phase when it's too late, when you have a few seconds to reach a bucket or a window or the edge of a cliff in order to relieve yourself. And if you ever seen somebody else being sick, you see this fear in their eyes for a few seconds when the process is already happening, but for now it's happening inside and there is no way to stop it. It's a pretty dramatic thing, but it works, it looks, it feels totally like a fixed action pattern in the bird. So we totally also have it, even though, as you noticed, in us, they are kind of a little bit more physiological. We don't retrieve our young using fixed action patterns, but there are things that we do that are also stereotypic and patterned. And that brings us to an interesting philosophical point. When we talk about animals, when we discuss animals, when we study animals, there are two types of mistakes that we can make. And one is the danger of anthropomorphism. So obviously a naive person, when they see a bird retrieving the egg, they may feel like, oh, the bird cares about its young, which is kind of true. But does it mean that what happens in its head is similar to what would happen in a head of a human mother when their kid runs away from them? No, not necessarily. We don't know, but most probably in this case, most probably not. The bird doesn't go like, oh, Timothy, you escaped again, come back to the nest. It doesn't happen like that. We don't know what animals think. We don't know how they feel, whether they think and feel at all. Even though it looks like there is a goal in this behavior to bring the egg back, we have actually just noticed that there is no goal in it because the bird never checks. It almost feels like it acts. It almost feels as if there was something robotic to it, doesn't it? And so that's one type of danger. Danger of assuming that animals are just like humans, just little humans. It's called anthropomorphism and we don't like it. But then there is another danger as well. That's also what people think sometimes. They think that the animals are kind of dumb, humans are kind of smart. So animals are like instinctive and they're like hardwired. They're like machines, which is a very old school view. And humans are all logical and they can think and they learn stuff. And, there is something to it, of course, but there is no dichotomy. It's not like we come from two different universes. We have instinctive behaviors. Instinctive is not a good word, actually, but we have behaviors that feel kind of more hardwired, even though, as I mentioned about sneezing, there is still often a learned aspect about it. And animals can do logic. I mean, there was no logic in this behavior, but you can teach a goose to solve simple puzzles, I guess. I never tried, but I would assume that you could. So there is no huge divide. It's more like a messy gradient where the border between what humans and other animals can or cannot do is kind of blurred. Real life is complicated. People may err on one direction or in another, and both extremes are probably wrong, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Okay, next, what starts the behavior? So we see this behavior, the egg rolling behavior. Let's just come back to it because we know it already. What starts it? What makes it happen? And in this case, we know the egg. But what is it about the egg? If we want to know how this behavior happens, if eventually we hope to get to the brain, back to the brain, and try to figure out what happens in the brain, we need to first understand what is it about the egg that the bird notices, what does it pay attention to. All of these words are a little bit metaphors, but you know what I mean, right? So try to develop a study plan, then continue the video. Good. So here's the results from an actual paper studying this question. You can see a bunch of eggs, and the closer the eggs are in this direction, the more the bird liked it. And the number near the egg indicates its size. Can you guess what happened here? How can you figure out which egg the bird likes more? So one thing you could do, you can just give the bird different eggs and see how likely it is to try to roll it. Or another option could be to look at the time it takes the bird to notice the egg and start rolling it. But actually an even better approach, which is a little bit trickier, is to actually make the bird choose. So we can give it 2 eggs and see which one it will roll first, because obviously it cannot roll 2 eggs at the same time. And in order for all that to happen, you kind of have to have fake eggs, right? Probably what happened, you asked some person with a lathe to make some wooden eggs for you, and then you painted them, and then you gave them to a goose, trying to see what eggs it will try to roll. Because now you can do an experiment. Now you can control something about the bird's environment and look at its responses. So what can we learn from this plot? There are at least 3 takeaway messages that we can take from here, at least 3 non-obvious conclusions that we can make from this plot. Please pause the video, take some time, and try to interpret it. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the realistic egg, the egg of the correct coloring and correct size, is shown with this symbol, like this one. This one is the one that's the most realistic, that looks most like normal goose egg. Try to figure out what can we learn from this preference table for different kinds of eggs. Good, let's see what we have. First thing that you immediately notice is that some parameters matter. The size of an egg is clearly a factor here. When you offered eggs of different size to the goose, they produced behavior with different efficiency, and it looks like the bird was preferring eggs that are slightly larger. Larger eggs were preferred to smaller eggs. So you can start to dissect what makes an egg a good egg, what the bird is paying attention to. The size is clearly a factor. And then when you offered eggs of different colors, it also was a factor, because as you can see, red eggs had to be slightly larger to be as efficient as a natural colored egg, while a green egg could have been slightly smaller and still had the same efficiency. If you look here, the larger the egg, the better. However, you can use an egg that's slightly smaller, that's 8-sized egg, so it's of the same size as this egg in the main row, but the green 8-sized egg was as good as about 9.5 normal colored egg. And on the other hand, the red 8-sized egg was only as good as the 7-size naturally colored egg. So color also mattered. The bird preferred eggs of one color to eggs of another color, and you can kind of find the correspondence point of like how much smaller the egg has to be in order to be as efficient in evoking the behavior if it's of a different color. So some parameters matter. That's learning point number one. Learning point number two is that some parameters make sense. For example, larger eggs were preferred. Can we explain that evolutionary? So why would it make sense for a bird? Why larger eggs trigger the behavior more efficiently? Are larger eggs good? I guess the answer is yes, right? A larger egg means a better chances of survival. It's harder to give birth to a larger egg because ultimately you're a bird, so you lay eggs and eggs don't grow. They don't change size. If the egg is large, it's harder to lay, but if it's already in your nest, the hard part is done. If you manage to give birth to a large egg, you'd better care about it. So the second point is some of these parameters make sense. The third point, however, is that some of the parameters may not make sense, or at least not immediately. For example, why green eggs are better than natural colored eggs? I don't know. Are there real green eggs in nature? Not for this species. Maybe there are some birds with green eggs. I mean, I'm sure there are. But in this case, a good egg, it's speckled so that it wouldn't be too conspicuous, noticed on the ground, because you have all the raptors and, flying predators. So you want the egg to be camouflaged. Green eggs are just not a thing, but for some reason, the bird preferred green eggs. Some parameters may not be easily explainable. That's also a learning point. Finally, what's the best egg ever for this bird in this experiment? The best egg ever was this large egg was pretty popular, right? But also this egg, which is not actually that large, it's slightly smaller than a normal egg, but it's colored very peculiarly. It's both speckled as a normal egg, but also tinted green, which is not a real thing. The learning point is that the best stimulus is not necessarily the most realistic stimulus. The most realistic egg, speckled size 11, is kind of smack in the middle of the diagram. There are lots of eggs that were preferred to it, and at least some of them never happen in real life. And yeah, by the way, you could also change the shape of the egg, and they totally did it. So they tried square eggs and cubic eggs and elongated eggs. It's just not shown on this plot, but if you want to read more about egg rolling, you can study works of Tinbergen. There are lots of interesting stories, and he also wrote a popular book about his life and his experiments. Okay, let's try to reapply this logic to a completely different species and completely different behavior. Just to check if we can get it, if we got the logic right. This is a fish called a three-spined stickleback, which is apparently a common fish in Europe. It has some interesting behaviors. For example, it builds nests. Here, males have this red underbelly, while females don't. A male guards its nest, and if a female approaches the nest, the male is all inviting and it's like, please female, come to my nest, I have a really nice nest, let's have a family. But if another male approaches the nest, the host male kind of gets aggressive and goes all like, go away from my nest, it's mine, I'm waiting for a good female, you go away. So we have a very different reaction to males and females. How to study that? What makes the difference? What does the male care about? Because they're different in several different aspects. The size is slightly different, like the shape is slightly different. What matters? How do you study that? What's your plan? Like, think about it, pause the video, and then we continue. Good, so what you can do, you can try to separate different aspects of what makes male a male. You can give it a realistic fish, you can give it unrealistic fishes, you can change the shape and the size, and then there is the red underbelly. And it turns out that the red underbelly is the only thing that matters. It's the most distinctive feature of a male that's active sexually. But that's kind of an evolutionary explanation. That's how we try to interpret our results. But the results are what they are. And in this case, we can relate to them. But you can imagine a situation when they would be confusing, like those green eggs before. And the stimulus that triggers the behavior, that initiates the behavior, is called the releasing stimulus. Like the egg, the roundness and size of the egg, so the round egg-shaped object in the egg rolling behavior, or this red underbelly on a moving thingy with an eye. I didn't mention the eye. The eye is important in case of protective behavior in a three-spine stickleback. It's called a releasing stimulus. I guess back then mechanical metaphors were still more common, so they didn't come up with something electronic or even electric. They thought about that as a spring, I guess, that's loaded and is ready to do something and is only waiting for this something to release the spring that is loaded. And here's another example about courtship and quails. I could have asked you a similar question. How do you study courtship and quails? And then the answer would be, okay, let's just give a male different things that are related to a female, because there may be different things that a male is looking for. Maybe it's shape, maybe it's size, maybe it's smell. Some birds can smell, some birds cannot. Quails are not particularly good smellers. It may be the sound, right? So there are lots of different aspects. And it turns out that in quails, the only thing that matters is a head, and that the head is sticking upright. So if you give a male quail a head on a stick, the male quail will happily court it. It will like walk around and preen and whatever they do when they're trying to find a good pair. As you think of it, and especially as you think about those green eggs that never happened in nature, but that nevertheless were so popular with geese, the next question that you may have is, okay, can the stimulus be so good that it becomes bad again? Do you know what I mean? Like, for example, here, the bigger was the egg, the better it was received by the bird, the more the bird liked it. But can the egg be too big? As you go with a bigger and bigger egg, will there be a point when the bird will be like, nah, that's weird, this egg is too large? And the answer is unexpected. In many cases, it's hard to find a stimulus that's too good. As you make the egg bigger and bigger, the bird keeps preferring the bigger egg, up to a point when it totally cannot even incubate it. Like if you make this model egg, this huge egg to a bird, it totally abandons the real size egg and in this pathetic way tries to climb upon it. And I guess the fact that the shape of its eyes is like it is makes it particularly tragic. It looks really tragic, this bird, doesn't it? It breaks my heart. But anyways, that's what happens. The egg cannot be too big for the bird. And it requires a question. It begs the question, why? How can it be? How did they manage to survive if they tend to prefer these giant unrealistic eggs to realistic eggs? Why wouldn't they have some way of knowing that this egg is not real and cannot be incubated? Try to answer this question. How can something that strange and inefficient exist without dying out, basically? Yeah, the answer is there is no point to prepare for this situation, right? There was no selective pressure for that. Evolution never tried to shape the behavior of the bird in such a way so that it would reject big eggs, because it was never a problem. If you happen to have an egg in your nest that's larger than the rest, you are happy. You managed to give birth to a large, healthy egg and you didn't die, so you'd rather invest your efforts in it. Evolution doesn't know what will happen. The way evolution works is if you make bad decisions, if you are less efficient than your brother, then you have fewer babies, but your brother has, or your sister, and so whatever genes encode a useful trait had a better chance of staying in the population. But evolution cannot prepare for the opportunity that suddenly a human will show up and will put eggs size of a basketball in the nest. So whatever behaviors the bird had worked perfectly well in the wild and still work perfectly well, even though they look so illogical to a human. But any new behavior, any new type of hardwired or learned reasoning, any type of computation, which is a charged word, requires brain power. It requires brain circuits. It is expensive and you will have to pay for because you will have to have a larger brain and spend more energy on it, and it will be heavier. So smartness doesn't appear for the sake of it. Evolution doesn't try to create a smarter species. If a smart individual can outsmart those around it, maybe it will become a new feature. Maybe the species will gradually develop ability to think logically. But in most cases, it's not really required because, again, why would you theorize about the egg size if the behaviors that you have already work just fine? And so an interesting question here is, are there supernormal stimuli for humans? Because we can make fun of this bird with a really large egg, but what about humans? Do we have some stimuli that win over natural stimuli? And it would be especially interesting if you find some stimuli that not only win over natural stimuli, but are also not helpful. So not only not realistic, like those green eggs, but also not helpful, like these really large eggs, size of a basketball. Is there anything in human life that's reminiscent of that? Think about that, make your bets, then continue the video. That's the best I could come up with. I don't know what you thought about. Was it junk food? Was it something else attractive and useless, like those kittens? There are clearly things that are unrealistic, that are kind of exaggerated, that are not necessarily good for us, but that we prefer to a more common, more natural thing. So it's easy to be condescending when you see something like that, when you see a poor animal doing something that's clearly not productive. But if you think about what humans do, I won't continue this thought, but you can finish it for yourself. Are we really that different? Okay, new topic. Social behaviors. Social behaviors are interesting. For example, back to the gulls, to the seagulls on the cliff. Remember the photo? As you look at them, you realize that they do certain things that are clearly meant for communication between different individuals. They have these long calls and they have this mewing, and they have something peculiar that's called choking. And sometimes you can see two seagulls facing away like that, and it seems to mean something. So animals tend to communicate between each other. And when they do, these behaviors are usually very stereotypic. So why is social language so stereotypic? What do you think? Should we really expect social interactions, social behaviors to be stereotypic? I guess the answer is yes, they have to be stereotypic. And you know why? Because it's kind of a language. And in order for communication to happen, if you want some particular sound to evoke a particular reaction in other members of the species, you really want the sound to be recognizable. You really want the sounds across different individuals and across different situations be similar to each other. And in this case, we have a courtship ritual. So all these behaviors starting from a long call and then mewing, which is another type of vocalization, and then choking that I'm not sure how it feels, and then facing away that looks like a dance. All this dancing is a part of a courtship ritual, which is something that happens when animals look for a mate and they're courting each other. They're trying to figure out whether they can form a pair, whether they can make babies together. Here's an example of a courtship ritual in swans, and it's kind of pretty, isn't it? So tender, so elaborate. Courtship rituals can be pretty elaborate. They can have these sequences, and it only goes from one step to the second step if the previous step succeeded. So if you're mewing with another seagull and your partner doesn't mew properly, then you don't progress to choking. And if they don't choke well, then you don't do facing away, and so on. Why? So we figured out why social behaviors can be expected to be stereotypic, but why courtship rituals even exist. Why have this chain of behaviors? That's the definition of a ritual. Why have this chain of behaviors where each behavior triggers the next one? Why have it? What's the point? Why would it evolve? The answer is finding a pair is hard. Finding a good individual to mate with is hard, and yet it is very important. Because the survival of your genes is in stake. The health of your future eggs, chicks, larvae is in stake, right? You want to find the best partner possible. But unlike humans, birds cannot really get together and discuss potential partners. They cannot be like, don't go with this seagull. He is actually a jerk. He never brings fish home. He just eats all fish alone on a cliff out there. You cannot do that. So you have to find other ways. Evolution had to find other ways to make sure that this individual is suitable. What does it mean, suitable? Suitable means of the same species, because you probably don't want to mate with someone of a different species because your offspring won't be viable. Second, healthy. They have to be healthy. If they cannot care for the kids in case you are planning to take turns fishing, or if they have a genetic problem that can decrease the survival of your kids, then investing in them is probably not the best idea for the purposes of procreation, right? We're not speaking morals here. And third, they should be in a good place as far as hormonal status go. They should be mature enough, but not too old, right? They should be able to produce offspring for you. And a ritual, something hard, something useless, but hard to do properly, is a good way to check whether all of these things are present. If someone can go through all these motions properly, if they cannot continue, probably something is off. Maybe they are a hybrid with a different species, or maybe they're just young and cannot do that yet, or maybe they don't have enough health to sustain this weird chasing and choking and meowing and facing away for a prolonged period of time. And then you won't mate with them. So it's a decent way to find a good mate. Kind of like a job interview. Job interviews are often not similar to the job itself. It's some random questions that people ask, but arguably they can help you to at least reject people who are completely unsuitable for the job. So kind of similar thing here. Here's another example, a mating ritual in a fruit fly. It has several steps, exactly same as for a seagull. There is orienting phase first, and if it goes well, then we get to tapping, whatever it means, and then if this goes well, we go to the most romantic phase of all, called singing. And in a fruit fly courtship ritual, singing means for a male to extend one of their wings to the side and vibrate it. So it's like flying, but not flying. They don't move it in the same way as they do in flying. They just produce one sound and the female hears it. And this singing happens. And if singing went well, then we go to the maybe less romantic phase called licking. And if licking went well, and during licking they basically check the pheromone, whether the chemistry is right, then you go to the attempt and copulation. And if attempt goes well, then you go to real copulation. So this is with fruit flies, and we really like fruit flies. Why do we like fruit flies? What's special about fruit flies? Have you heard why fruit flies are pretty famous in science? Genetics, right? Fruit flies is a classic organism that people study genetics on. So we know how their genes look like. We know their chromosomes, we know their genes, we know their genome for longer than most other species. So much is known about fruit flies compared to most other species you can think of, even like mice. And so the moment we realize that the courtship ritual is so complicated and so elaborate, in fruit flies, we can ask questions about genes that underlie this process. And in this video, you can see the singing phase. See the male extending their wing and vibrating it. You cannot see the vibration or hear it, but believe me, it's happening. So you can, for example, ask questions, what genes define the progression from one step to another? Or what defines the quality of the song, the frequency of the song? What genes are involved in females' detection of this song, like recognition of this song and preference to a particular frequency, and so on and so forth. You can ask so many interesting questions and figure it out. So the summary for this part, what have we learned? We learned the name and the definition of fixed action pattern, stereotypic behavior that's always performed to completion. We talked about releasing stimuli that trigger the behavior and how to study them and how to dissect which features are important for the behavior and which are not. We learned about supernormal stimulus, which is the stimulus that's unrealistic and better than the realistic, better than a naturalistic stimulus. And we introduced the ritual, a sequence of behaviors, a sequence of fixed action patterns where each next fixed action pattern has the successful completion of the previous one as a releasing stimulus. Right? So like choking is a releasing stimulus for facing away in Seagull courtship ritual. And we talked about courtship rituals and why they exist. So how to transition from behavioral science to behavioral neurobiology? Because we discussed the behaviors, but now how to make next steps. Once we are ready to make the next steps, once we have the methods and the questions to ask, how to shift from just observing behaviors to figuring out the neural mechanisms that underlie these behaviors. There are two parts to the answer here. One is we need to find good behaviors, and actually we also need to find good species, which is an important point. We need to find the behavior, we need to have it well described, and we need to pick a behavior and the species that kind of match our question. And then the last step will be how to relate it to the nervous activity. So for the first part, just extrapolating from everything that we said, that animals move and animals hunt and animals court each other and they care about their young, like egg rolling is an example of caring about the offspring, even though the offspring is round at this point and doesn't squeak. It doesn't make it any less of an offspring, right? We can kind of go further and expand this list to some sort of classification of behaviors that animals do. For example, like what can we think about? Foraging, getting food, and fighting, aggression within the species probably, escape behaviors. So escape behaviors is like all sorts of hiding and avoidance and freezing if the animal tries not to be seen, or flight, like really quick escape if the animal can try to escape in order not to be caught and eaten. We already talked about one of those, about an escape in a crayfish, and we'll talk about at least one more. Courtship and mating. So these are complex, but also very isolated, which makes them interesting and attractive topic for research because they're so formulaic and so ritualistic, and at the same time so controlled by, say, hormonal status. A whole bunch of interesting questions here. Mothering the young, so care about the offspring, protecting the eggs, feeding the young, everything that's related to that. Construction of a nest is interesting, even though it often is performed as a part of this let's have some babies activity. It is also a hard engineering problem for many species. Whether you're building a nest from twigs or from sand, or you make a hole in the ground, it is a complex behavior that is often quite demanding in terms of cognitive efforts. Migration, navigating the environment in general, but also long-distance migration are an interesting example of also a relatively isolated behavior that can be studied. Grooming is interesting because it's so ubiquitous. Animals preen and groom and clean themselves and care about their talons or claws. These behaviors are easy to observe, they're everywhere, and even though they're kind of low-key, they're important and potentially easy to study. And also the last 3 points are those behaviors that maybe you wouldn't think about as behaviors necessarily, but because they're kind of more nuts and bolts, they're very important. One is everything related to sensation. So it's not a behavior per se, but you can try to isolate sensation as long as you have some behavior to use as a readout. So for example, orienting behavior, which is like, what's that? That kind of behavior. Some animals move their ears only, but a behavior that helps animals to locate the source of a sound or pay more attention to a moving feature in the landscape can be studied on its own, but they can also be used in order to figure out what stimuli it can perceive and which ones it cannot, and what stimuli are more salient. Salient is a special word, meaning relevant, noticeable, important for the animal. Locomotion is another example of a behavior that you maybe would not name if asked to generate a list, but that is actually hard and very species specific. It sounds weird, species specific. But animals fly and swim and slither and all sorts of different ways of locomotion that all present unique challenges. And so you can study how they come about and how they're controlled and how they're learned or hardwired and maintained and adjusted, adapted if the animal is hurt or if the environment is slightly unexpected and different than it usually is. All sorts of interesting questions here as well. And finally, we shouldn't forget about basic physiological acts. Sneezing in humans or vomiting in humans. If a barnacle opens its shell and extends the hunting arm or whatever it is called, is it more physiological or is it hunting? It's an interesting behavior. And so now the second question, how to relate. So let's say you have a behavior, you picked a species, and you found a way to record from this species. So now you record. And so what? Let's say you have a species, you identify the behavior, and you have access to a part of the brain that you suppose probably mediates this behavior, underlies this behavior. This is the part of the brain, probably. That's your hypothesis, that makes this behavior possible and that performs the calculation that are necessary for it. How do you study that? How do you prove that this part actually is the substrate for the behavior? How to prove that this part of the brain is what makes this behavior possible, controls it, maintains it, mediates it? That's not an obvious question, that's not a trivial question, and it has not one, but about 3 different answers. So pause the video, take some time, think about it, then continue and compare it to the official answer. There are about 3 different answers that you could have given. One first step, obvious first step, is just to see whether this part of the brain, whether this neuron, this nucleus, this area of the cortex, whatever it is, this ganglion, whether it is active when the behavior is happening. It's called correlation. Because if that's not the case, then obviously this part of the brain doesn't have anything to do with it, right? So every time the mouse grooms or a bird screams, sings, or archer fish ejects a stream of water to kill a bug, if a part of the brain gets activated, okay, there is hope, but it's not enough. Because there may be other reasons why this part of the brain is active. Maybe just when a beetle snaps its mandibles, it feels something, and it is actually this feeling that gets registered by this particular part of the brain. So what to add to the story in order to make sure that this part is actually what makes this behavior possible? 2 parts are missing. One is called sufficiency, whether it is sufficient to activate this part in order to cause the behavior. And the easiest way to figure that out is to stimulate. So you could stimulate, that's probably what you answered. You can stimulate this part of the brain and see what happens. And another part is necessity. And sufficiency and necessity, perhaps you figured out that they come in pair. Necessity is another kind of logical thing to do. Let's inactivate this part. Let's cut it out or inject something that would temporarily disable it or cool it down. With many animals, you can actually do targeted cool down of a part of the brain and see which behaviors are lost. And if it is lost, then this part of the brain is necessary for the behavior to happen. Here's a schematic representation of the same idea. So correlation is basically every time the behavior is happening, you notice that this part of the brain, again, neuron, nucleus, region, ganglion, gets activated. And then you can stimulate it and see whether it's sufficient to cause the behavior. And you can somehow inactivate it and to figure out whether it's necessary for this activity to happen in order for behavior to happen. Together, sufficiency and necessity, and perhaps correlation as the lower bar, is what is classically assumed to be enough to claim that a part of the brain underlies a certain behavior. And it is a reductionist approach. Sometimes it works. With some behaviors, especially those that are kind of isolated, say grooming in a barnacle, or vomiting in a human, or courtship in a fly, intuitively you can expect that there may actually be a separate circuit. Because, it's so isolated and you probably can imagine an animal that lost this behavior but retained all the others. So you can hope that reductionist approach can help here. It's not a perfect approach in the sense that with some behaviors, like taking care of your young, of your chicks and fry and puppies, in a case like that, most probably the behaviors are so complex that you may not be able to find one part about which you would say that's where love for the babies is sitting. I use the word love incorrectly here, but you know what I mean. When behavior is so complex and is probably so integrated to everything else that animal does, the hope that classical reductionist approach will work is lower. but at least you can try. And it is one of the classical ways of thinking about relating brain activity to behaviors. And here's an example. A bat against a moth. Bats that use echolocation and hunt at night like to hunt moths. And there are two parts to this story, and both are very interesting. One question you can ask is how bats can find moths, because they use echolocation. That's good, that's already very complicated, but it turns out that bats can notice a moth because it moves its wings, and because of that, the echo, the ultrasound echo, because bats emit ultrasound and listen to the echo, the ultrasound echo has a flutter to it because of the movements of the wing of a moth. The echo changes and the bat immediately notices that, okay, it's not a leaf, it's something more tasty, potentially, a moth. And you can study where in the bat's brain the circuits that identify this flutter sit, and indeed people studied that and continue to study that, and we have some idea about how the bat's brain is organized and which parts are specific for moth detection. And that's a very interesting question. But another thing you can do is to study what happens with the moth, because it turns out that a moth has a special behavior. When hit with the ultrasound wave, it desperately tries to pretend that it's not alive, but that it is in fact a leaf and shouldn't be eaten. It has a special ear that's sensitive to ultrasound and special circuits, special neurons that connect sensory neurons in this ear to motor neurons in its wings. So when it's hit with an ultrasound wave, moth stops flying like a normal moth and just randomly tumbles down, pretending to not be alive so that it wouldn't emit this typical echo sound, and so that its trajectory would become random and sort of inanimate. And you can study that, and people study that. And apparently you can also use that for a party trick in a very specific kind of party. So apparently if you ring your keys, if you shake your keys in front of a moth, because keys, when you ring them, emit lots of ultrasound, a moth would try to avoid a bat and it would do a pirouette in the air. I never tried it myself, but I read about it on Reddit and it sounds reasonable. So that's an example of how you can use this reductionist approach to studying neural mechanisms of behavior. And with that, this lecture is over. Thank you. Talk to you later.